This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm your host, Gilad Halper. Every week we bring you conversations with authors about their books and their research and other things that we like and find interesting. Now, if you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll down to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon. Click and support us. Some of you have been doing this for months and years, and we cannot thank you enough. And before we start, an announcement. As some of you may know, Daria Shendlin, my co-host for the last 5 years, has stood down. So I'm delighted to welcome my new co-host, Yael Bada, to the show. Welcome, Yael. Hello.
Hi. Thanks for inviting me. Okay, our guest today is an anthropologist at the University of Edinburgh whose new book, The Invisible Palestinians, The Hidden Struggle for Inclusion in Jewish Tel Aviv, has just been published by Indiana University Press. Dr. Andreas Hackel, hello and welcome.
Hello, everyone.
So to help us get our bearings, we can start by maybe explaining who these Palestinians that you studied are and what are they doing in Tel Aviv in the first place?
So the Palestinians I studied in about two and a half years of continuous research in Tel Aviv as an anthropologist are mostly Palestinian citizens of Israel, but also Palestinians who live under occupation in the West Bank and are commuting and moving into Tel Aviv and other places in Israel for work, sometimes on a weekly basis, sometimes on a daily basis. Some of them stay longer. But so there is this combination of two kinds of Palestinians. We could say the Palestinian citizens of Israel, who have Israeli citizenship but are by different degrees not equal citizens, and Palestinians from the West Bank.
So why focus on Tel Aviv? What are the inherent characteristics of this city in particular in relation to other places in Israel?
Yeah, Tel Aviv is in a way the place where I noticed that very little has been said and talked about when it comes to the Palestinians within the Jewish city of Tel Aviv. And I think one of the reasons is that Tel Aviv is the quintessential modern Jewish Israeli city. It is, not so long ago, it celebrated its 100-year anniversary. I mean, it's a few years ago now, but still we can talk about a modern urban space that has been built essentially in ways that were imagined to be in opposition to Palestine and everything Palestinian and Arab here. So in a sense, it was a European-style, Western, modern city. And it is still perceived in such a way by foreigners. For example, I mean, Tel Aviv is imagined as a Mediterranean metropolis. It is also communicated and imagined as this very likable and liberal city. It is, in a way, the Israel's liberal big city. And so it was very interesting to me to explore what would that mean from a Palestinian perspective.
And you really make that very, very clear, the relationship between Palestinians and Tel Aviv as a space. And you have these maps in the beginning of the book that are extremely revealing. So how much does the space of Tel Aviv and the way the city is built, how much does that have to do with the necessity of Palestinians to be invisible, like the title of your book, Invisible Palestinians? What is it about Tel Aviv, rather than, say, for instance, Jerusalem, that makes Palestinian invisible or that they need to become invisible?
Yeah, I mean, as the title of the book says, this is one of the main topics in the book, the invisibility of Palestinians in this space. And I think there are different layers to that. The first layer, which I explore in that first chapter, is about movement and the invisibility that is created by how Palestinians and Palestinian citizens of Israel are arriving or not arriving in Tel Aviv. And when you think about what does it mean to arrive and be a citizen in a city, and so most Palestinians that I have spent time with are working in Tel Aviv. The young generation, many of them are students at Tel Aviv University for several years. Many others are just working, they may be commuting, but in total there is still a large mass of Palestinians in the city every day. Many of them are residents, many of them are commuters. But so what does the urban space do? Why are they invisible? In a way, that also begins, historically speaking, when Tel Aviv now stands in places that were historically Palestinian villages. Tel Aviv University is, in a way, the neighborhood. Sheikh Muniz is still, in a way, built on that original name of Sheikh Muannis, the Palestinian town that was there. And you can see how the city historically has sort of overwritten this history of Palestine and Palestinians within Tel Aviv. And then secondly as well, the border to Jaffa. Everyone knows that Jaffa is an increasingly sort of orientalized space. A lot of Tel Avivans and foreigners go there to enjoy the Arab atmosphere, really. But of course, Jaffa itself has been massively depopulated. People have been displaced from there when Israel was created in the sort of also the Arab-Israeli War of 1948, and there was a lot of displacement from Jaffa. So that created in itself the precondition for Tel Aviv to overtake Jaffa as, Tel Aviv, a city that really emerged from Jaffa, from the Jewish community, but then overtook Jaffa. And in a sense, this new Tel Aviv sort of creates this conditions where the Palestinians that are not in Jaffa, but in the Jewish side, in Tel Aviv, are pressured in a way to moderate their visibility as Palestinians. And I think this is what you were talking about as well, Yael, that what makes them invisible. On the one hand, it's pressures that are external, such as the need to moderate how you're perceived as a Palestinian in times of political tension, during particular moments, or as you're passing the security guard when you're entering the train station. And there are a lot of situations like this where Palestinian citizens of Israel might feel that they are potentially stigmatized or singled out for being Palestinian, but they choose in certain situations to conceal or to mitigate that in order to access, in the most basic way, access a kind of a train station, or to feel like you can access the city's qualities of being just a big city without being stigmatized, without being having people point at you and say, oh, what are these Palestinians doing in Tel Aviv? So there's this external pressure in a way to moderate, and that also relates to accessing jobs where employers or people who are examining candidates that apply for jobs in Tel Aviv. Some of them might be graduates from Tel Aviv University, but these students often feel, although they are politically active, at the same time they feel the pressure to try and, at least as the public visibility of that is concerned, to try and suppress certain parts of how visible their political activism is. What can they make visible and things like that. So that's the sort of the external pressure. And just very briefly, there's also the other element to that between Palestinians, to be in Tel Aviv is also in a way sometimes considered, you could say, politically problematic, immoral, especially if you are a young Palestinian citizen of Israel. You might have come from a different town or village in the north, and then you're in Tel Aviv and you're immersing yourself in the city because, of course, you are young and you want to explore the city, whether it is the Jewish Israeli city of Tel Aviv or it is just any city. But then it is never just any city, because Palestinians might also pressure you to not delve too deeply into the city, to try and keep a very clear boundary between making use of the city and enjoying it.
Not sell out, in a way.
Yeah, I think in a way there is a pressure to not sell out or to... so there are these pressures from different directions.
Do you think that your work puts Tel Aviv's reputation as this liberal bubble in perspective? Because, as you say, for many of them, living in this so-called liberal paradise is perhaps more difficult than in other, maybe more conservative places in Israel.
I think, on the one hand, the book is a clear critique of this idea that Tel Aviv is a city that is liberal and open to diversity for all people, because surprisingly, Palestinians are not necessarily part of that idea of diversity. And that is very clear when you read the book, that you do realize that the invitation of the liberal city for any individual to enjoy it and to be there, to work there. And there are so many nicknames for Tel Aviv, as you well know, and that's not just, some people call it the startup city, or they call Israel the startup nation, and there's people call it the bubble or the city that never stops, and things like that. So all of these expressions really refer to what you say, the idea of Tel Aviv being a liberal city, but also a bubble that somewhat shields this particular place from other areas of religious political extremism and conflict and violence. So there's this idea that Tel Aviv is a space of exception in a way. And I think, so to come back to your question, the Palestinian perspective on Tel Aviv, yes, on the one hand, it is critiquing this sometimes stereotypical idea of Tel Aviv being this paradise of civil liberties and things like that. But at the same time, I think their perspective also creates a new opportunity to reimagine what would it actually mean for a truly inclusive and open city to incorporate that Palestinian part of diversity as well. But as you know, many of these questions go deep into history and would probably require a very serious self-reflection on behalf of the Jewish Israeli majority in the city of Tel Aviv to even begin such a process.
So I want to ask you more about this invisibility thing, because you write that on the one hand, Palestinians are trying to become invisible in order to pass. But on the other hand, they are visible. They are so very visible, even in this very diverse city. It's almost like diverse except for Palestinians, or liberal except for Palestinians. Can you tell us more about that? What is that experience? And when you speak about opportunity for change, what could that look like?
So you say they are very visible in some ways, if I understand you right, but at the same time, there are these levels of invisibility. So, I mean, they are visible, and I think increasingly it is very, normal on an everyday basis to, of course, in Tel Aviv, if you open your ears and you know what language you hear Arabic in places, and Palestinians in Tel Aviv are, as I said, workers from the West Bank who might work in the kitchens of the restaurants. They're building the skyscrapers of Tel Aviv. They're driving the buses of the city. Palestinian citizens of Israel driving the buses of the city. They work in high-tech offices. They're doctors in the hospitals. They're staffing the pharmacies and the shops. Of course, if you think about a population of a city not just being its officially registered residents, but its total mass of humans that are in the city for the majority of the time, I would say that Tel Aviv is probably coming close to a mixed city. It is, of course, the big taboo to call Tel Aviv a mixed Jewish-Arab city. But when you think about it like that, it might as well be. But the problem is that it completely denies that reality, and that is visible. So what does it mean to deal with these different kinds of invisibility, I think, is also what you asked in your first question. And I think for many, and now also there's an importance, of course, to really draw a clear line between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Palestinian workers from the West Bank, including those who might not have official permits. And for those, of course, invisibility is much more a forced condition that is the result of, the labor regime that is governing how long are they allowed to stay if they have a permit, where are they allowed to work. But if they have no permit, of course, and I spoke with some workers, and they're also in the book, who are in Tel Aviv without these official permits, and for them invisibility is a need to basically not get detained, to stay afloat. They're sleeping in construction sites.
So just to clarify, right? So you're talking about different kinds of Palestinians here, right? So you have the Palestinian citizens of Israel, and you write about mainly students and activists. They're usually from towns from the north. And then you're writing about the workers that are coming in from the West Bank and governed by a very harsh military permit regime, right? And then you have those that are here, what would be so-called illegally, because they don't even have that permit. And so when you're talking about their need to hide, you're actually talking about very different populations. But what happens when people, when Jewish Israelis are seeing Palestinians? Do they know the difference? Do they know how to make that difference between the different kinds? And what price does each population pay for that kind of visibility?
I think Jewish Israelis in Tel Aviv are used to seeing Palestinians in workplaces, and they're used to seeing and assuming that a lot of the workers in the city are Palestinians. But in a sense, to see a group of Palestinians having a large table booked in a Tel Aviv restaurant and speaking out loud in Arabic for a whole evening, this is something that is still very unusual. And in the book, you will also find stories of, the sort of the middle-class Palestinian elite with Israeli citizenship and who live or work in Tel Aviv, and they have been doing a lot of these events, social events, meeting for dinners, and that creates a sense of hyper visibility that I think someone described it as a kind of shock to the city. So there is this moment of not necessarily a negative shock, that can also be a kind of curiosity from the side of Jewish Israeli people passing by, but sometimes it is a shock that also leads to a defense mechanism. I describe some Palestinian protests that took place in some central areas of Tel Aviv. And there I encountered a face of the so-called liberal Tel Aviv that I wasn't really expecting. I mean, there was a lot of very fierce and defensive reactions from people shouting at them, go back to Gaza, or you should be happy that you're not in Syria, to people actually spitting at protesters and talking to the police to dissolve the protests and things like that. So you can see, on the one hand, we're talking about a kind of visibility as let's say, as an Arab or a Palestinian on a basic level. But then when you talk about political visibility as a collective, that is, again, a totally different conversation. And I think people are used to encountering Palestinians in Tel Aviv, whether they have Israeli citizenship or not. And that is, people are used to that. But to actually see a collective, to see that shock is less usual. And I think it does create a certain defensive mechanism among some people in the city where they have to,
And what about the Palestinians themselves? I mean, it seems like that the individual invisibility comes from a different place than the collective invisibility. I mean, the fact that they're on the one hand really trying to immerse themselves in a way, but still are, when it comes to the collective protesting, I mean, it's a pretty brave thing to do in today's Israel, as given all the backlash that you described. How do they reconcile that?
Yeah, I think what I heard from the people I spend time with, and they will always know in many ways better than I do, but what I would say is that Tel Aviv doesn't necessarily invite that tendency to stage protests. And there are frequent Palestinian protests in Jaffa, and there have, of course, been mixed protests and also Palestinian protests in Tel Aviv. But this is really not what the book is mainly about. It is about Tel Aviv as a space of pragmatic inclusion, in a way where people are seeking out careers, jobs, and then on the other hand, it is about just this urban space, to get access to the urban space. And the contradictions, so how do they reconcile these different kinds of invisibility is really a question about, it is not a question about assimilation or something like that. I think it's very important to draw a distinction here. There is a tactical choice to sometimes make things visible or invisible, such as the choice not to speak Arabic on your phone when you're passing a security guard, just because you don't have the time. You need to get to your appointment, right? Or other situations like this. But we are not talking about a kind of dissimulation or assimilation where people are actively trying to change who they are. And the interesting thing about the complexity, how people reconcile this, is that I have spent time with Palestinian citizens of Israel who are, from the foremost sort of families of political elites and activists in the country. But at the same time, they also sometimes wanted to enjoy Tel Aviv without being marked. And what does it mean to be marked? That can mean that you are sometimes individually or with a Jewish friend or with an international friend, or you're kind of just trying to take part in the city. But once your visibility as a Palestinian becomes known, sometimes you're misrecognized, that Jewish Israelis in Tel Aviv, and I heard these stories a lot of times, ask Palestinians who don't look stereotypically Palestinian, where are you from? And then I say, I'm from here. And then I said, no, but I mean, where are you from? And especially, I feel that happens a lot to Palestinian women who are maybe not looking along the lines of the stereotypical idea of how a Palestinian woman might look like, and they're constantly misrecognized. So either they're looked at from this exoticized perspective, or they're misrecognized, or they're stigmatized. So just to emphasize, right? Mm-hmm. Invisibility is sometimes a tactical choice, and it has nothing to do with whether or not you are changing who you are.
Yeah. Many of the age range of the people that you talk about is between the early 20s and the early to mid 40s, more or less. And, it's true that this Palestinian presence in Tel Aviv is a pretty recent phenomenon. I'm a Tel Aviv native, and I remember that, 20 and 30 years ago, hearing Arabic on the street was very, very, very rare. And now you see, you hear Arabic on the street. When you go to the Tel Aviv University campus, you see women wearing hijab. This is something that was completely unheard of within my living memory. And I want to ask, you also write about these people that to them, and I quote, Tel Aviv is a city that is used rather than a home. And so is the presence, do you think, transitory? Are they going to move back to their communities at some point? Or the fact that, there aren't any old-timers in Tel Aviv has to do with the fact that it's a really recent phenomenon?
Yeah, in a way, it is a city to be used because a lot of young people, and you're right, most people in the book are maybe between their early 20s, talking about the student population, or their mid-30s, late 30s, and most people who do end up living here for a while, for a few years in the Palestinian community, they tend to not yet be married, and they're still studying or they're working. And of course, the working class, often they live here in overcrowded apartments. These are Palestinian citizens from any other area within Israel, and they simply come here to accumulate as much money as they can because maybe they want to open a business back in their hometown. So this is also about using the city in a way that it is a place to work, to earn money, and so on. But you also see that I think there is a tendency that more and more Palestinian citizens of Israel are deciding to live in Tel Aviv, even after they're married. Sometimes that is a difficult choice, and in many cases that depends on the kind of process of talking about these things with the rest of the family. But there might just be an increasingly strong reasoning when it comes to professions, careers, with a lot of jobs being in Tel Aviv, and that maybe, and I don't know because that would require another few years of research, but maybe we are in the process of witnessing a slow movement from this transient, fluctuating presence I talk about in the book to perhaps a more stable presence where growing numbers of Palestinians do feel like they can, at least for themselves, try and see Tel Aviv as a home. But then the problem is that Tel Aviv constantly rejects that request and claim for a home because, as I show in the book, these incapacities of the liberal city to really account for the diversity that Palestinians bring with them and to also accept their political presence, their identity, their collectivity, all of these things ultimately mean that urban citizenship as a kind of equal citizenship that also has a right to not just be in the city and use the city, but also a right to transform and shape the city. And I think most Palestinians in Tel Aviv do not feel that they are invited to contribute to the shaping of the city's future and present.
So I wanted to ask you about this because you really use your research not just to talk about Israel-Palestine or not just to talk about Tel Aviv, but also to make theory. So you speak about using the city with not just through mobilization and rallies and political work, but through this kind of daily tactical use. And you write that this has implications for other minorities as well. So other minorities and how they shape metropolises. How do you think from the exceptionality of Tel Aviv in Israel-Palestine to other cities?
Yeah, that's a good question. Of course, a really solid answer would require far more comparative knowledge than I have about what is going on in many other cities in the same way. But one thing I can say is that there is some really other good writing about how, on the one hand, inclusion can be disempowering because often there is this idea, people who are included in a city, whether they are poor or whatever. So inclusion in the city is always positive, which it is not. But it's not always a positive thing because people can be included economically. And I think this is also this sort of idea of economic citizenship that is flawed because this contract that might exist between people from minorities that are living in majority-dominated cities who are somewhat stigmatized, maybe because they're part of an indigenous minority or because they're racially stigmatized in other contexts. So they can at times be invited to have this silent trade-off with the city, to say, we love you, stay here, you're part of our diversity as long as you contribute, you work hard, and you keep on paying your contributions, your taxes, and so on. But we do not necessarily want your particular minority to stage a protest, to become visible, to make claims that disrupt the norms of the everyday life in a city. So what I was trying to do in the book is that I was thinking, okay, what I'm looking at here is probably not a case of resistance, because Palestinians in Tel Aviv are mostly not actively resisting sort of the national level politics while they are in Tel Aviv, because again, it comes back to the majority of them are approaching the city as a place to be used. But I do think when you accumulate the thousands of individuals that are using the space to advance their careers, they are in Tel Aviv to create new realities and encounters between Jewish Israelis and Palestinians through their presence in the city, through their interactions. And I think all of these interactions and claims involve claims. If you are in a city and you refuse, you actively make a claim to the city, but you do it silently. And I think this is what I was thinking through in the book. What would that mean for other minorities? How could you try to actively gain access and use the opportunities that you find to improve your own condition, situation, and also at large to improve the overall economic standing and prospects of your community, but not necessarily by claiming visible resistance practices. So this is about accumulations of thousands of individual acts happening on every single day, and people do. Just the last sentence here, and I have heard a lot of Palestinian students at Tel Aviv University say things like, I'm studying cinema here at Tel Aviv University because I want to make great films about Palestinian resistance movements, for example. And they said, I'm using these opportunities to be stronger against what I don't agree with. And others might do an internship in a law office in Tel Aviv, and then they go back, open their own law office somewhere else, having gained new experiences and professional networks. And of course, the high-tech industry is also an example where a lot of that is happening, where there's a lot of social mobility taking place, and Tel Aviv becomes a jumping board for professional social mobility for Palestinian citizens of Israel as well. So I think, yeah, it's a difficult topic.
Sorry, I want to ask you how you think your work ties into the broader scholarship on understanding the Israeli-Palestinian situation through a settler-colonial prism. I mean, what sort of insights do you think this paradigm offers in the case that you study?
Yeah, I actually started out from a fairly critical perspective when it comes to, sort of picking a framework like that without necessarily feeling it comes to you from your research. But what I encountered was really, it came to me through my research. And I think for me, the real strength in it is that once you start to analyze things, for example, I wrote an article in a journal about the good Arab, which is a big prominent concept that exists here, but also elsewhere. And it's related to things like, what is a good immigrant? What is a model minority? What is or historically speaking, the good savage against the bad savage. And we're talking about, or Arabs against Berbers, thinking in the Algerian context. So there's settler colonial movements always try and, in a way, distinguish between allies and opponents among the local indigenous population. So this idea of the good Arab, the Palestinian that is invisible, is hardworking, is not questioning the existence and authority of the state of Israel, and is mainly trying to stay invisible and agreeing with this pragmatic idea that they mainly want to sort of contribute and advance individually, but not collectively and not on the level of resistance. So take aside this idea of the good Arab. So this is one thing that I saw reflected a lot in Tel Aviv. A friend of mine who, I went to rent an apartment with at some point, and landlords say things like, we only take good Arabs. And that happens all the time. That happens on a daily basis in Tel Aviv, that Israeli landlords say, do you speak Hebrew? And these people are Palestinian citizens, and they don't even understand that, of course, they speak Hebrew. Are you a good Arab? So this is, for example, one colonial pattern of, you could say, dividing and ruling the population. But much more than that, I think the settler colonial framework, if you want to call it a framework, but for me, it is basically looking at the history of the space of Tel Aviv and seeing a logical connection between how the space of Tel Aviv was built and imagined as a European, Western-style settler city, of course, the Jewish city, and how the invisibility of Palestinians today is actually a continuation of this longer historical process by which the state of Israel, you could say, contributed significantly to the destruction of Palestinian urbanism, and then overwrote this history with its own urbanity, from which the idea of a Palestinian visible presence has been excluded.
Okay, and Dr. Andreas Hackel, an anthropologist at the University of Edinburgh and the author of the newly published The Invisible Palestinians, The Hidden Struggle for Inclusion in Jewish Tel Aviv. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
And many thanks to you, Yael. How was your baptism by fire?
So interesting. Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity.
And I would like also to thank Tai Shelem, the manager of TLV1 Studios. And now a request to you, our listeners, because many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcast app. And we would like to ask you to please write us a review of any kind. You can support us by going to our website and subscribing onto our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive. It has more than 700 interviews to keep you entertained and hopefully annoyed as well. Like us on Facebook, follow me, and also now you can follow Yael and the podcast on Twitter. And join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, from us here in Tel Aviv, goodbye.